Okay, we are recording. Hello, ladies. Welcome to Halacha Level 2, class number 2. We started last week to speak about the history of Halacha. We went through a little bit of the basics. When was the first Jew? Was Avram the first Jew? Yes, he's spiritually, but is he halachic? Not so clear. We spoke about Mount Sinai, that Mount Sinai is the main beginning of when HaKadosh Baruch Hu, when God comes down to us, tells us, Alo, I am God, gives us 2 commandments, maybe 10 commandments. Moshe goes up, learns the oral Torah, comes down from the mountain, begins to write the written Torah, either writes it piece by piece or completes it at the end of his life. We have ourselves an oral Torah. We have ourselves a written Torah. So now, B'ezrat Hashem, for the rest of the class, I want to try to go to the end I want to try to get us from Moshe at Mount Sinai through a couple thousand years of history to where Halacha is today. But before we start that, if everybody could write their name in the chat for attendance purposes, that'd be awesome. Name in the chat. Okay, awesome. Awesome. Okay, fine. Okay, so let's pick it up where we left off last week. We have ourselves a written Torah and an oral Torah. Okay, this is level 2, people. You guys should know this. What's the written Torah? What makes it the written Torah? What are the books of the written Torah? Hannah.
The 5 that we learned?
Huh?
The 5, like Genesis and like
Yeah,
that?
5 books of Moses. Good. That's the first part of the 3. There's 3 sections to the written Torah. The first section is known as Torah itself, 5 books of Moses.
Nevi'im
Okay?
and Ketuvim.
Nevi'im and Ketuvim. Good. We have the prophets. We have the writings. What's the difference between the prophets and the writings?
One was told from Hashem to Navi, and then one was us talking to Hashem.
Good, good. One was God speaking down. That's the prophets. The other one is our divinely inspired man thoughts of how we relate to God. And that's going to be like Tehillim, Shira, Shirim, Song of Songs, and stuff like that. Okay, awesome. And we had this kingdom in Israel. Any halachic questions are going to the courts. We had a court system going on. We had tribes. Some were known to be higher level of scholarship. Levi was known to be a tribe of scholars. Shimon was teachers. Yisachar was known to learn. So you had certain tribes in Israel that were known a little bit more for their Torah and their education. But anybody who really wanted to learn and spend the time could do it. So you can come from other tribes and learn. And halacha was asked amongst the courts, and they discussed it. And it was very, very oral. But then life gets difficult. We have a first temple is destroyed. We start going off into exile. We're going to lose 10 tribes of Israel. Then we come back. We try to rebuild. But not everybody comes back. A bunch of Jews stay in Babylonia, stay in Babel in Iraq. It's only a small group of people that say we're going to try to rebuild the land of Israel. But they come back, and then ultimately what happens? They also get destroyed. A second temple gets destroyed. And then the people that were in charge, the Romans in particular, they made life very difficult for the Jews. Because the Romans were like, "Allo, you can't learn Torah. We don't allow Torah." Similar to what was taking place in the Soviet Union not too long ago. You're not allowed to learn Torah. You can't do a Brit Milah. You can't keep Shabbat. Like the main Jewish laws and rules and mitzvot, can't do it. What did people do? They would hide. They would hide in caves. We back it up a little bit. We had the story of the Maccabees where they're spinning the dreidel inside we're spinning the dreidel outside to remember they used to play games to hide the Torah learning. But the Romans come along, make life very, very difficult. Comes along Rabbi Yehuda Nasi. Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, he's the big rabbi. His name is Rabbi. Actually, let me share my notes with you. We'll see it inside. Okay. Comes along. In the year 200, we have a rabbi named Rabbi Yehuda Nasi. He's known as Rabbi, the rabbi. He says, we're starting to forget everything. It's getting very difficult. Oral Torah until that point, we spoke about last week. Why did we keep it oral? So we can discuss it. We can have a teacher-student relationship. We spoke about the oral Torah being more fluid by not being written down, being a little bit more gray, being able to adapt to the times. But Rabbi Yehuda Nasi comes along and says, life has gotten too difficult. And because life is so difficult for the Jews, we can't remember. We're not going to be able to remember the oral Torah. We're going to lose Torah if we don't write it down. So we did something very special. He said, we're going to write down the basics of oral Torah. We're going to take the main laws, And we're going to divide it into sections, 6 main sections. And in those sections, one will be about agricultural law, one will be about the holidays. So it'll talk about Pesach, and there'll be a book about Yom Kippur and about Shabbat, and another book will talk about marriage laws, divorce laws. Another book will talk about monetary laws, tort law. Another book will be about criminal law. Different sections, 6 big sections of laws. And it's called the Mishnah. And until today, people study Mishnah. Some of you might have studied Mishnah in high school. In Israel, we teach it to our kids. In America, not as much. The Hebrew language is a little bit harder, and people teach more ideas in America, less actual content, because people want to build up the philosophy on a little more American ideal. In Israel, we actually want to build up the philosophy, but we have the Hebrew skills. So we're teaching our kids from a very young age these laws, the rules. So my 9-year-old son has already learned 3 major sections. He finished up Shabbat already, finished up Sukkah already, and he's spending a lot of his time studying Mishnah in his little yeshiva, where they go through the laws. It's the basics. It's simple. It's just rules. And that's what they wrote down. So the oral Torah, the basis for Jewish law, was written down in the Mishnah around the year 200. Fast forward a couple of hundred years, and people have questions. People are like, those laws were written very terse, very simple, and there's more questions on it. It's not so clear. Different opinions. And people start fighting it out. Now, in those days, there was 2 yeshiva systems going on. There was the yeshivas in Israel, under a rabbi named Rabbi Yochanan. He had a whole yeshiva system in Israel. And then in Bavel, in Iraq, in Babylonia, they have another yeshiva system. And the rabbis would travel back and forth with each other. And the Gemaras will discuss the messages that they would send, the questions they would send from back and forth to the yeshivas. They would talk the halacha between each other. And the Gemara, and these questions over the next couple hundred years, eventually get written down in what's called the Gemara. The Gemara, one version of it was written in Israel, known as the Gemara Yerushalmi. The Gemara is the commentary on the Mishnah, where, as opposed to the Mishnah, which is just laws, the Gemara gives the backgrounds, the sources, the fights, dissenting opinions. It goes through everything. There's philosophy, there's monetary law, there's math in there, there's science in there. Everything is in there. A little bit complicated to find an actual rule, because it's written more like constitutional law, where legal theory is what's being focused on much more than the actual section. So while the Mishnah was very clear laws, the Gemara is the legal theory behind everything, but it's all over the place. So in the year 400, they write the Gemara, they put it together with the Mishnah into one book, and that's known as the Talmud. The one written in the year 400 is known as the Talmud Yerushalmi, the Jerusalem Talmud. It actually wasn't written in Jerusalem. Jerusalem was destroyed at this point. It was written in the Galil area. So that's the Jerusalem Talmud. And 100 years later, we have what's known as the Babylonian Talmud, the Talmud Bavli. That becomes the more important one. Although you can study the Jerusalem Talmud today, the Yerushalmi. There's an English translation published by Art School nowadays. But the Bavli, the Babylonian Gemara, that becomes the main Talmud that people are studying till today. Those of you that have friends in yeshiva and seminary that study Gemara, that's what they're learning. Those of you that are in Rabbi Khan's Talmud class by us, you're learning the Talmud Bavli. In the Agarata class, he's going to quote from the Talmud Bavli. This is the Babylonian Talmud, which is studied until today. It's deep in thought. It'll build your brain, but it also will give you the depth of halacha from all angles. Okay. Questions on anything I said until now? Questions? Let's move on. Okay, so now we fast forward. So at this point in history, the Talmud Bavli is coming out. It's getting getting a lot of importance in the world of Judaism. Israel at this point kind of gotten much weaker. We don't have much Torah coming out of Israel. We don't have much people. There's always very important right now, very important Israel point, just because the world's at war with us and we're at a war of public opinion as well. There were always Jews living in Israel, even as it got to become a very small community. And at times, Jerusalem was off limits to us. But other parts of Israel, the Galil area, eventually it's going to turn into Tzfat as well. Israel always had Jews. Until today, there was always been a Jewish population. It was small, it was poor, but there was always Jews living here in Israel. We are the indigenous people to this land, and nobody should ever be able to claim to you that we're some kind of European colonialists that came out of nowhere. We're going to get to where the exile happened and how Jews got to Europe. But Jews also got to the Middle East, and half of this country is Sephardic Jews as well. And these arguments that are being made in the world news today that you can be reading on some of the more popular newspaper outlets, the mainstream news in the area, it's just not true. It's not true. Jews have always, from a historical perspective, Jews have always lived in Israel. Okay. But the community was weak, and the stronger community was in Iraq. And at that time, if anybody had any questions, they would ask the poskim. The poskim were the big rabbis who knew the halacha, and we're now in the period of time known as the Geonim. Geonim in modern Hebrew means the geniuses. So the Geonim, that's what they called the rabbis back then that were living in Iraq. And you don't have to know names, but there was like Rav Sadia Gaon, there was Rav Hai Gaon. These are some of the more famous names of the Geonim. They had a yeshiva, and they were running yeshivas over there, and they were answering questions. And in English, there's a very fancy word for that. It's called the responsa. Responsa, in simple English, is responses. It's responses to questions. In Hebrew, it's called she'elot uchuvot, questions and answers. And that's how halacha worked for the next 500 years. People would ask questions to rabbis, and rabbis would answer. And if the rabbi was popular enough and the questions were strong enough, he'd write them in a book and publish those books. And if you go online to with your Bar Ilan ID, you can go find these books of the questions and answers of the Geonim, and you can see what was bothering them in the year 600, 700 in Iraq. Okay. At the same time, though, the exile, Jews are traveling around. Already for many, many years, there was a strong community of Jews in Egypt, in Alexandria. But Jews start to travel more. They're traveling more towards the west. They're going to move towards to Tunisia, to Morocco. They're even going to get to Spain. And they're going to go for business opportunities. And they're going to travel east. They're going to go south. They're going to go down to Yemen. They're going to go to Iran. They're going to be traveling to Greece. They're going to start traveling to Europe. They're going to make it to Ashkenaz, to Germany, to France, to England. And then as you keep fast forwarding with time, they're going to start moving towards Eastern Europe, Poland, Ukraine, Hungary, get over to Russia. But Jews are slowly, over these hundreds of years, traveling all over. The exile is getting much further, much faster. Let's ask a question. You are now living in Spain in the year 800. Is Spain a big Jewish community? Anybody know? Spain a big Jewish community? So not yet. It's beginning to grow. When we get to the year 1100, 1000, 1100, 1200, we're going to get to the golden age of Spain, where there's going to be big community centers and rabbis, and they're going to be involved in philosophy and the military. They're going to be doing unbelievable. The community is going to be great. But in the year 800, things are just starting out. Okay, so you are now a Jew in a brand new neighborhood in Spain. Okay, Sapir, let's ask you a question. Sapir, you with me? You are now a Jew in Castilia in Spain, and you have a halacha question for a rabbi. You want to know, let's go with a simple question. We're not going to go, some questions are very hard. There's life and death questions, but you want to know, simple question. I want to light Shabbat candles. Do I make the bracha before I light or after I light? Who do you ask your question to?
And there's no local rabbis?
So it's a new community. So, for those of you that come from big cities, like New York and stuff, there's like rabbis in every corner in Brooklyn. But when a community just starts out, when it's just beginning, you don't have rabbis yet. You have the business people. You have people who want to make money. Eventually, they're going to form together a shul. They're going to make a synagogue. They're going to build a mikvah, bring out their families. Eventually, they're going to open up a school. And when they have enough money, they're going to buy books and they're going to try to buy rabbis. Spain is going to buy major rabbis over the next 200 years to the point that they're going to open up yeshivas that are going to be greater, and Spain is going to rise and Iraq is going to fall. But in the year 800, Spain is not there yet. You don't have those rabbis. You might have the most learned person there, they'll probably call a rabbi. But he doesn't have books. It's before the printing press. It's whoever was rich could pay somebody to copy a Gemara for you and try to bring it to Spain. What do you do?
Wow, I'm not sure. But even back then there was no technology, so I'm trying to think outside the book. I don't know.
There's no WhatsApp, there's no emails, there's no phone calls. What are you gonna do? Anybody have any ideas? What do you do? Anybody want to go into communications? Communications majors over here? What do you do?
Send a letter.
Huh?
Send a letter.
Excellent, Zoe. Excellent. You send a letter. You send a letter to get the answer. How do you send a letter back then? So sending a letter was a big process. Now people wanted to communicate. The world always wanted to be connected. So people want to communicate. So the early forms of like post offices is already existing, but it costs money because in order to get a letter from Spain to Iraq, you have to travel a lot. You have to go through Africa, and back then it was dangerous. You couldn't travel by yourself. Even today it's not so simple to travel by yourself all over the place. But you're traveling, and you have to send it with people. So you're going to send it with like a caravan that's going through. Now, that group that you send it with have to have guards. They have to. All these people want to be paid. And as you're going through different countries, you got to pay import taxes. You got to put a stamp. You got to pay for a stamp, the earliest stamps, and you got to get that letter all the way across. Now it's going to take a while because travel is slow, and as you get to the main cities, you have to stop, sleep for a bit, buy new supplies. You have to have water and food, and you have to change caravans to the next one. Eventually, though, it gets to Iraq. Also, if you're a young community who's trying to make money, what do you want to show off to all your family and all the Jewish communities and other places? That you actually are making money. And you want to thank the rabbi for taking time to answer the question. So you'll send a little bit of a donation to the yeshiva as well. And the rabbi looks at the question, starts to answer it. Now, some of the questions already happened. So sometimes they'll ask the question like, we didn't know what to do. The person passed away 2 hours before Shabbat started. And we know we're not supposed to dig a hole on Shabbat. So should we have started or should we have waited till after Shabbat to bury the body? Like, what should we have done? So we did X, Y, Z. Was that the right thing to do or not? And they'll probably say a bunch of questions. The rabbi gets it. The big Gaon gets it in Iraq. Starts writing the answer. Sends back a response. Now, everybody from all over the Jewish world are sending him questions. So he's getting a lot of questions. And people want to learn new Torah. They want to modernize Halacha. So what does he do? Or what do his students do? They write down the questions, and that's like, and they copy those books and send them out to people, so that way you can learn the answers. And till today, you can go online today and through your Bar Ilan ID, and you could find Shoot Bar Ilan. You could find the answers of the Geonim. You could find their responses. You can find their question and answer books, and you can see what the questions they were dealing with. The business questions they were dealing with, the family matter. You can get a lot of history lessons. What was going on in those days based on the halacha that people were asking back then. Now, the letter could take somewhere between 6 months to a year to get back to Spain. The story goes, if you wrote down in the history books, what would happen when they would finally get their response? The Jewish community would be so excited. Praise God. The rabbi answered us, and it made it through. A lot of times, mail maybe wouldn't get answered. It got answered. We got our answer to our questions. So they tell us, what would they do in one of these cities? They would take the letter, they would put it on a silk pillow. They would walk the silk pillow into the synagogue, and the whole community would get there, and they would dance around, they would sing, they would make great desserts, and they would read out the answer out loud. And then whoever was the most learned group of people would sit there and they would learn it, and they would treasure that Torah, because that was now part of the new Torah of their community that got answered. Okay. So that's happening in Spain, the year 800. Fast forward a couple hundred years, fast forward to the year around 1100. And at this point, Iraq has gone down. The golden age of Spain has risen. The Muslims in Spain were very open-minded. They were very good to the Jews for most of the time, not all the time, but for the most of the time, they were pretty good to the Jews. And there was this idea of intellectual knowledge and study and religion and Torah and mathematics, and everybody's studying. And Jews are making money, and they're involved in the governments, and they're involved in everything going on over there, and they're very smart. They're becoming doctors and surgeons, and they're also becoming rabbis. And they had imported major rabbis already, major teachers. They had bought libraries, and it was already considered to be a level of importance to spend your money on Torah books. And they became a real center of Torah. This is happening in Spain. This is happening in Germany and France. They weren't they weren't doing as well monetarily, but they were doing as well in Torah-wise. In Germany and France, a little bit in England, we have ourselves Torah communities, and they're learning Halacha, and they're learning Gemara, but they realize that the Gemara is a very complicated book, because it's not as, the Mishnah was organized, but the Gemara that really explained everything. And then all these question and answer books that we have, it's all over the place. We need something a little more simple that we can follow. The average guy is getting more intelligent. He wants to read Torah too. What's he going to read? So the rabbis of that generation were no longer in the Gaonim, now in the period known as the Rishonim, the early rabbis. The early rabbis, the Rishonim, they started writing simple books that, or really very complex books, but simple to read books that discuss Jewish law like in its entirety. They wrote books of mitzvahs. 3-4 different rabbis published a book called Sefer HaMitzvot, where they go through all 613 commandments, explaining the commandments. The most famous one being the Sefer HaChinuch and the Rambam's Sefer HaMitzvot, Maimonides' Sefer HaMitzvot. We get to this Rabbi Maimonides. Maimonides is known as Rav Moshe ben Maimon. He is a super genius. This guy does everything. He's a doctor, he's a philosopher, and he's a posek. He's a guy that is an arbiter in halacha. And he writes books and everything. And he practices medicine. He actually, his day, the Muslims weren't the best. He had to run away for a bit, or for a while, he ran away. He had to run to Egypt. And in Egypt, he becomes the doctor to the Sultan. And he spent most of his day being a doctor. And that's why you have all these hospitals all over the world called Maimonides, named after this rabbi. But the other part of his job was he wrote books for the Jewish community, very high level books. Nobody knows how he had enough time to do this, because he writes about himself in his own journals. It took him an hour and a half just to travel to work every day on his camel. So the amount of time he had, and he cried, he didn't have enough time to write, but he did write. He wrote book after book after book, and he wrote a book of philosophy known as Mor Nevuchim, which showed mastery in Greek philosophy, in Arabic philosophy, and in Jewish philosophy. And then he wrote his magnum opus, the Mishnah Torah. The Mishnah Torah was 14 volumes. We went through every single Jewish law, from the Torah, from the rabbis, customs, explaining the rules from A to Z. And it took hundreds of years to realize how sophisticated and how clear this code of law was. Because afterwards, at some point, somebody started counting it, because it was very big. It was 14 volumes, a lot of rules. And they counted 1,000 chapters, which means the Rama from the very beginning had a whole plan of how he's going to write Jewish law. And it was clear, it was concise, it was in simple Hebrew, although some people got upset at him, because he wrote in his intro, this can replace the Talmud. The Talmud was the holy sacred book. People got upset at saying that. It was even going to lead to book burnings. The other thing which he regretted, he didn't put his sources in. Later on, other rabbis would try to find those sources, but he didn't write his sources. So even though it became accepted, especially in the Sephardic world, but even in the Ashkenazi world today, but back then the Ashkenazi world was a little more hesitant at the beginning, but it became a major, major, major work. At the same time, other rabbis started writing codes of laws. One was known as the Tur Shulchan Aruch, where the Rambam had written about everything. But now rabbis were saying it was too big. It was written in simple language, but it was too complex. It was too much. Let's just write a book of laws that deal with the rules that existed in their generation. Meaning the Rambam wrote about the temple. He wrote about Shabbat and the temple. But there was no temple anymore. So we don't have to read pages and pages of temple laws if we just want to know how to be a good Jew. Just write a book on how to wake up in the morning, how to keep Shabbat, how to get married. Those are the laws, how to keep kosher. Those are the laws that we need. And people started writing those kind of books. Now, something terrible happened to Jewish history. We have ourselves Spain, which was this great place for Judaism, turns over. The Christians get rid of the Muslims. They take over. And it took a little bit of time, but they were a lot less tolerant. And eventually in 1492, we have the great expulsion of the Jews. And for the first time, it's not the first time we went into exile, but we have these refugees that are now scattered. And the trauma from these refugees resonates until today in Jewish history. We still have people who identify today as Sfaradim, as Sephardic Jews, from this original refugees who went everywhere. Some ran north to the Ashkenazi countries. They went up to France, to Germany, and other areas. Others went south to Morocco, Tunisia. Now, there were Jewish communities in all these places, but there were so many Sephardic Jews who just got everywhere, and they were very learned that they turned out, especially in the African countries and the Asian countries, when they made it to Syria, when they made it to Greece, when they went to the Mediterranean countries, they were so smart in Torah that they actually took over. And any Jews that were there became Sephardic, even if they weren't originally from Spain, because they just got into the Torah that they brought. But it was a community that was crushed from being expelled, but at the same time, found a way to recreate themselves. The Talmud in Babel was written after the second temple was destroyed. We find a lot of times when we have these great catastrophes in Judaism, we find a way to bounce back. And we bounce back as a people, and we bounce back as here in Israel, the creation of the state of Israel, and we bounce back in Torah. And now, if you were a Jew, now the refugees went everywhere, and those that tried made it to Israel. And in Israel now, Jerusalem is still, there's some Jews living there now, but it wasn't the strongest community. But up in Tzfat, because Hashem, those that make it to Israel here, eventually we're going to get trips up to Tzfat. In Tzfat, it's the holy city. Till today, it's a very spiritual city. And in those generations, now 1500s in Tzfat, is now a generation after the expulsion, 2 generations after the expulsion, we have ourselves great rabbis. And we have ourselves darshanim, and people who talk about the parsha. There's a rabbi named the Al-Sheikh, he knew how to talk. This guy was charismatic. He got in front of the synagogue and he spoke, and people could listen to him for hours. Then you have yourself rabbis who were interested in Kabbalah, the Arizal, Bavluria. This is the one of the main commentators of the Zohar. He's doing the mystical teachings happening in Tzfat, and he has a big following in Tzfat. And then we have a rabbi named Rav Yosef Karo, and that's what we're going to get to in my notes over here. Rav Yosef Karo, he's the leading posek, the leading halacha guy. A posek is the guy that is posek. He's the one that gives the rules in halacha. He's a child. He's a descendant of a refugee from Spain, from a Sephardic Jew, and he's looking around Tzfat, and he sees there's a lot of refugees from everywhere, and everyone's coming with their customs. That guy came to Israel from Spain. That guy came from Egypt. That guy came from Syria. That guy came from Yemen. That one came from Greece. That one came from Germany and from Poland and from people are coming from everywhere to Israel. And there's the customs are just like too different. There's too many arguments happening. I got to make it simple for everybody. So he said, let me go back to the main books. And he picked 3 books. One was the Rambam that we spoke about, and then 2 other rabbis. 2 of them were Sephardic, one was Ashkenazi. And he said, let me take these 3 big rabbis, and I'm going to go majority rule. If 2 out of 3 rabbis say A, and 1 rabbi says B, I'm going to go with A. I'm going to go with the majority and make a simple book of halacha. And he called it the Shulchan Aruch. Now, this rabbi had read everything, because he wrote another book that people study called the Beit Yosef, where he went through cliff notes of every rabbi to ever speak about a topic until his generation. And you see from his book that he had a lot of access to books. It's also the beginning of the printing press. So books are now becoming a little bit easier to get. And he himself writes his book knowing it's going to be printed. He took it to the printing press to get printed, and he understood about layouts of pages and font settings and chapter titles. And he knew his book was going to be a success and tried to form it in a way and market it in a way that people were going to read it. Those are going to go into marketing. People today are writing doctorates at Bar Ilan about how Rav Yosef Karo marketed this book of the Shulchan Aruch, because he knew what he was doing. So he takes this book, and his book starts to spread throughout the Jewish world. It even makes it to Poland, to a rabbi in Poland named Moshe Isserles. He was the great Ashkenazi rabbi in Krakow, Poland. Those that have been in the March of Living, you might have gone to his shul. Those that are, we'll see if we're doing a Poland trip this year. But if we do a Poland trip this year, we normally go to the Krakow synagogue and we pray there for one of the things. That was our Moshe Isserles' synagogue, and in his shul, he's the big posek. The Shulchan Aruch, this book, the Shulchan Aruch means the set table, because Rav Yosef Karo said, "I'm setting the table for you, making it easy." It gets to his shul. Anybody tell me how does the book get there? How does the book from Tzfat get to Krakow? Or why does it get there? Any ideas? Why does this book get there?
Could it be people moved there?
People move there. Okay. People are traveling around. It could be. And someone who's traveling around brings the book with him. Okay. Taking place, but not as common. Meaning more people are probably moving from Poland to Israel to make Aliyah. If you're leaving Israel, you're probably going to go to one of the closer communities, like Greece, like that. But it's true. People are traveling, and you travel with some books. Okay, true. Good. A little bit more. Other ideas? How do books get places? We see that books got everywhere. If a community was rich, a place like the Yemen community, the Yemenites were pretty rich. I think at this point they're already selling coffee and making a lot of money off of selling coffee beans. They used the money to bring in Torah because they were very proud of that. So they bought books. Okay, that's one way. The rich people want to have it. You see it today as well in the rich Jewish communities in diaspora libraries. It's here in Israel. Most of the Torah books today are being written in Israel by far. You have certain Torah books coming out of New York and out of New Jersey, out of Lakewood and Yeshiva University Press, a little bit from Toronto and South Florida, LA. There are certain places. Baltimore has some big yeshivas that are publishing things. But for the most part, most Torah books today are coming out of Israel. But it's easier to buy some of these volumes in Brooklyn than I found in Israel. There's certain volumes in Israel you can't get as easy as you can in Brooklyn. Because in Brooklyn, they're going to order the first copies of all these books, put it in their bookstore, and they're going to have 5 copies of each, and they're going to have a big supply. And in America, likes that big supply of things in the supermarket and stuff. You want to have it all there so you could buy it on the spot. Although truthfully, since Corona, it's getting harder and online is killing a little bit of that market. But at least 5 years ago, but even today, anybody here from Brooklyn? If you're from Brooklyn and you go on Coney Island to Makor Asfarim bookstore, it's easier to buy a book published in Israel in Brooklyn than it is in Israel, just because if a community has more money, it's easier for them to buy and store a lot of books. Okay. But in those days also, if you wanted to publish a book, especially if you were living in the Christian empires, in the Muslim empire was a little bit easier. But if you were living amongst the Christians needed to censor everything. They wanted to make sure that nobody was speaking out against the church. And they had Jews that had converted to Christianity, who spoke Hebrew, spoke Aramaic, knew how to study, who would read all these books to make sure there was nothing anti-Jesus in any of these books. And they would go through everything. And but in order to do that, you had to get to go to a censor. And there was taxes every step of the way. If you want to publish a book, it costs money. You have to raise money before you publish your book. But you'd go to the cities in Italy that would publish the books. Because right there in that same city, you'd have the publishing houses that had the ink and all that stuff, the printing press. You would have the censors there, the churches there in Italy as well to check it as well. And you'd stay there for a while. And it would be a couple months so you could publish your book. What's happening during those months? Other rabbis are coming there too with their books because they also want to publish books. And you're meeting rabbis and you're sharing books. And that's one of the ways that books are getting everywhere. And you make friends with those rabbis and you correspond and they become your friends. You're going to send questions to now. Another thing is happening. The other thing that's happening is that now in Israel, Torah is starting up again in Israel. Israel, for most of our history, after the destruction of the Second Temple, really after the destruction of the First Temple, but Israel has been very poor. You have to go back to King Solomon's time till we really were like a rich kingdom. But since the exile, since the destruction of the temple, it's been a very poor country. When the state of Israel was founded in 1948, we were a poor country. The 50s, the 60s, the 70s, we were a poor country. Things started to get better. The first time we really rose our head was in the early 2000s. When Israel became the startup nation, for the first time in Jewish history, we were like a real contender for the last 20 years when it comes to Parnasah, when it comes to making money. We're high tech. We're actually doing stuff here. We are a top country when it comes to finances. And when there were all these like financial meltdowns in America over the last couple of, when there was one that was like 15 years ago, and then during Corona, we did better than most of the world. We actually had to have a very strong economy. Now we have a war. Bezrat Hashem, our economy will be able to withstand it. It's going to be hard. We'll see what happens. We'll see how strong we really are here in Israel. But throughout most of Jewish history, we relied on donations. Even now during this war, the donations coming out of the diaspora right now from America, from Canada, from England, Europe, it's really France. It's really helping us. And we thank everybody who's supporting Israel right now during our war. It's a really big deal. But for most of our history, we couldn't survive without those donations at all, including the 1500s. And a lot of times what rabbis would do is they would send their students, or they would go themselves, and they would do fundraising trips for the community in Sfat, for the poor people, for the food kitchens, for the yeshivas. And these rabbis or their students would come to communities all over the globe. And wherever there was a big community, that's where they would go. And in those days, Krakow was one of the bigger communities. So probably what happened was one of the emissaries from Israel came to raise money. So how do you raise money? How do you raise money? Hannah, how do you raise money? If you are a fundraiser from Jerusalem, from Tzfat. You studied in Rabbi Yosef Karo's yeshiva, and you're a fundraiser, and you just came to Krakow, How are you going to raise money in Krakow? What do you do? Anybody here going to work in fundraising? I look at our alumni, statistically speaking, probably about 1% of our alumni, a lot of times the females, are going to work in fundraising at some point. How do you fundraise? Any ideas? Zoe, any ideas? Aiden?
You tell a story?
Oh, to who? How do you find people? Where do you go?
To your community.
You go to the Jewish community. It's not your community. You come from Israel, but it is your community because we're all Jews. We're all one big family. You go to the Jewish community center. You go to the synagogue, and you walk up to the rabbi. You say, "Hi, Rabbi. I am the student of the great Rabbi Rav Yosef Kar. I know you've heard of him. This great rabbi in Israel in Tzfat. I'm his student. We're raising money for the yeshiva and for the poor people of Tzfat. Does anybody here? Is there any rich person who wants to donate?" So the rabbi says, "You know what? I have a little money in my discretionary fund. Here's a little donation from me. And there's these two rich guys in the corner over there. They love to support Israel. Go ask them." And he thanks the rabbi, and he goes to those rich people. He gets money. He thanks them as well, and he gives them a present. What's the present he gives them? The book that his rabbi wrote in Israel, the Shulchan Aruch. Till today, rabbis are doing that. Till today, even myself, when I go recruiting for the program, so I stay at different. Sometimes when I stay in communities that I'm not from or I don't have family, I'll stay at alumni's house. And part of the time you give a present. If somebody hosts you for a couple of days, for a week, you give a present. You bring some flowers, you bring some chocolates, or I'll bring a book. Rabbi Khan, those of you that have Rabbi Khan for classes, is a big Talmid Chacham, and he's written a lot of books. So sometimes we'll take his book and we'll go, "Oh, here's a present from a book of Rabbi Khan. Our rabbi at Bar Ilan has books too. Take one of his books," and that's a way of saying thank you for giving a donation, or for doing a chesed, or just because you want to give a present to somebody. So the Shulchan Aruch gets into the hands of Rav Moshe Isserles, the big rabbi in Krakow. He looks at the book. He says, "Wow, this is an unbelievable book. This is a book of Halacha. It's so clear. It's so great." So he says to himself, "Wait a second. I was writing a very similar book. I was writing a very simple to read book of practical law. So what do? Similar book in the act of the biggest humility. Instead of making a competing book, see, oh, I'll buy that version, I'll buy that version. Instead of doing that, what does he do? He says, I'm going to stop writing my book, and instead, I'm going to write my notes in areas where I think the law is different." Meaning, he says that the Shulchan Aruch said, "I'm going to take the three biggest rabbis, 2 Sephardic, 1 Ashkenazi, and I'll go majority rule." But in Krakow, there were a lot more Ashkenazi rabbis over the last couple hundred years, and he noticed there was different customs. And he says, "You know what? I'm just going to write wherever the custom is different." So now in one book, the Shulchan Aruch, we're going to have the Sephardic Halacha and the Ashkenazi Halacha. And he called his book, he's called his notes, the Mapah, the tablecloth that covers the Shulchan Aruch, that's that table. And in one book, you have everybody's Halacha. And until today, this is the book that's being read and being studied by anybody who wants to become a rabbi today. It's the base book of Halacha, is the Shulchan Aruch. Now, what's interesting is it's beautiful because you have yourself a unified book for everybody. But at the same time, it also had the flip side. It also solidified much stronger Sephardic versus Ashkenazi. Because until this point, Sephardim didn't have such a clear book. Oh, this is Sephardic law. And it could be different Sephardic rabbis argued with each other. And different Ashkenazi rabbis argued with each other. And it could be the Jews in Germany did like the Jews in Morocco and not the Jews in Poland. It wasn't so black and white Sephardic Ashkenazi. But now when you have a book that's easy to read, that's being published and being sent everywhere, and everyone can read it. So, oh, that's Sephardic law. That's Ashkenazi law. So that also solidified much more different communities. Okay, that's the 1500s. Let's fast forward now. Let's get to today's time because we're almost done for today. We'll fast forward to today's time. What happens over the last 500 years? More responsa, more questions and answers. People are asking modern day questions. They're writing it in books. They're publishing these books. They're also writing commentaries on the Shulchan Aruch. The most famous being today, the Mishnah Berurah, is the Ashkenazi commentary from 100 years ago that modernized a lot of the Shulchan Aruch, where it gives modern day laws. People are writing their own guidebooks on the side. And then the most popular written book today are guidebooks on very specific topics. People are going to write 500 pages on the laws of Challah, 500 pages of the laws of Kippah, and they're writing about everything nowadays in very detailed halacha books, with a lot of footnotes in every language possible. And then the most modern thing to happen in halacha today is that today we're doing online halacha. That now we could ask a rabbi anywhere. So the response to the Q&As are online. They're in social media groups. If anybody here wants to travel to Thailand, there's a rabbi who has a WhatsApp group that answers kashrut questions. You just send him a picture of the food you want to eat, and he'll let you know, kosher, not kosher, I'm not sure yet. And these people know everything about the factories in India and all that. You have Q&A about everything. What social media has done today and what online has done today is it's given access to rabbis everywhere and instantaneous. It's also made questioners more anonymous, which also means you can ask things you would have been embarrassed to ask 20 years ago. So today, halacha is so alive, it's so vibrant, because you could ask anything at any moment, and you can do it anonymously, so you don't have to be scared. And now books are being published based on these questions that are being asked on social media. And that creates the bigger halacha picture of what we have today. If you haven't signed in yet, write your name in the chat. And any questions? 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 Awesome, everybody. Thank you so much. Shabbat shalom.
Thank you.
Thank you. Shabbat shalom.
Thank you.